Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I share 3 things that I learned from this podcast book, which I think will be helpful for any new podcaster starting their journey. The book was written by Chris Huskins, who was a radio presenter for about 7 years, then turned podcaster and marketer. I really like Chris's way of writing because it's very honest and a little bit self-deprecating, which adds a bit of humor when you're reading this. For example, with the introduction, he says, "Welcome to the most comprehensive guide to podcasting ever, ... probably." And then he goes on to say, "I hope this title doesn't get taken too seriously. Yes, I have put everything I've learned on podcasting in the book. However, I'm not arrogant enough to think that I know it all," which I think was really quite nice, a nice start. He's very, very candid and very open how he approaches writing this book, but there is a bit of humor as well, which is quite nice when you're reading it. In his book, Chris covers everything that a podcaster needs to know when starting their podcast journey. So he'll talk about at the beginnings, absolute beginnings, such as how to even think about what topics to talk about on your podcast. He also talks about idea generation, crafting your avatar, to also the practical elements, which is knowing which equipment to use and hosting websites that you need to consider when you want to launch your podcast. And then he also talks about the launch of the podcast and then subsequently what to do after. So all of the marketing and making sure that you grow your podcast. So I found it thorough and very detailed, and I really actually enjoyed the way he structured it. So as you can see here, there are 5 chapters that Chris put all his information into. I think the way that Chris structured the whole book in 5 chapters is really, really helpful. And so you'll see here that each chapter talks about a specific part of the podcasting journey. And I feel like chapter 1 was really, really important. I probably spent a few weeks, reading through chapter 1, and then also doing some of the exercises that he offered readers to do, which would help figuring out who your avatar is, trying to consider the different topics that you should be discussing on your podcast based on the engagement of current audiences within those topics, which I thought was really, really helpful. And then you'll see with chapter 2, recording, editing, and producing your podcast, it's not simply about just the equipment. There's actually elements of interview techniques and resources for editing, different options to approach your podcast recording. For example, making a podcast completely on your phone. And he also talked about intros and outros, which I thought was, for me, very, very helpful. What I also liked about the book was that he then delved into launching the podcast itself, which is very, very helpful because a lot of people aren't super familiar with hosting podcasts and exactly what you need to do in order to do that. And then you'll see that he talks about processes and hacks to keep the momentum going, which I think is actually really helpful because oftentimes you launch the podcast and then you don't really know what to do thereafter. I think that was actually really helpful that he added that chapter in to help keep going with every podcast episode and also hopefully grow your audience. I also really liked that the last chapter was about promoting your podcast, because I appreciate that the first launching it and then putting out episodes regularly is really, really important. But obviously at the end of the day, we want to be able to grow our audience as much as possible. And I think the strategies that he set out in chapter 5 are really, really helpful for growing the audience and marketing, essentially, the podcast, which I had never thought about because I am not very familiar with marketing in that way. So very, very good. So I thought that was really excellent. I liked the way he structured it. It was very, very clear. I liked the main subjects and then little subheadings under each one. So I think when I launch my podcast, I will definitely be referring back to this book and kind of going specifically to some of the areas. So I think that's really, really helpful. The first key takeaway is that planning and research is really, really, really important. You need to be able to know what you're passionate about and why you're doing this podcast. So I think that was the key takeaway that I got from chapter 1. Chris actually sets out various exercises to help you focus on your passions and help you decide what your podcast should actually be about. So Chris does this by encouraging readers to go onto their social media platforms and start getting ideas about the topics that they're interested in. He then suggests that people make a list of the topics that they're interested in and then see how much engagement there is on the topic already. He then recommends that readers go into their videos and photos and see what content they already have created on those topics. And that for him is a great strategy to kind of narrow down not only your passion, but what audiences are already engaging with. And also make sure that readers can also use the content that they've already created as a basis for their podcast and topics they want to explore. He actually recommends specifically that you write down 2 reasons why you are doing this podcast, and to be as honest as possible. And so for him, he gives a very honest account as to why he's doing his podcast. The main why is to help podcasters, but he still wants to make a career out of it for himself. So I thought that was really helpful that he was so, again, honest in the way he wrote and what he shared with the readers. And I think there's this consistent sort of theme throughout of just this like sheer honesty as to his own journey into podcasting, which I thought was really, really refreshing. So the second key takeaway that I took from Chris's book was about consistency and avoiding burnout. So in chapter 3, he suggests that all new podcasters should put together a list of all of the topics that one wants to explore over the next year. And he suggests using a Google Sheets or Excel document. And in it, he says that we should have the topic, the title, the date, the description of the show notes, and any tags or hashtags we want to use going forward. He also suggested setting out an extra column, which would enable us to keep track of outstanding tasks that still need to be done that are related to each episode. So that would be things like scripting, recording the actual episode, editing it, and obviously launching it. For me personally, I had already started doing that before I read the book, but when I read it, I actually said, oh, that's a really good idea, adding that extra column. And so then I did that with my Excel spreadsheet, and I found it really, really useful to keep track of all the different moving parts, because as many of us know, if you're a podcaster, you are doing essentially everything. So I think having a really good process where you can keep track of everything is very helpful. So the final and third key takeaway I wanted to share with you guys comes from chapter 5, which is all about marketing and growing your audience. And Chris shares with us a 90-10 rule, which is actually a concept that comes from one of his clients, where you focus 90% of your attention on one specific site, social media site or outlet, and 10% on the others. So the way you decide where you spend 90% of your attention is on the outlet where your avatar will mostly be spending most of their time. So for example, if your avatar was a 10-year-old child, you would not be spending 90% of your time and your attention distributing your podcast on LinkedIn, because the 10-year-old child will likely not be on LinkedIn, and obviously vice versa. So if your avatar it's geared towards, you know, people working in business, then you wouldn't be spending a lot of attention on Snapchat. So it's quite interesting. It's an interesting rule. And I think for me, I haven't gotten to that point yet, but I will be soon. And I think when I get to that point, I think it'll be really helpful to use the 90-10 rule so that I don't feel a lot of pressure having to distribute it on all different social medias. And I already have a little bit of stress of how to distribute it and repurpose it on all these different channels, when I actually think I should be thinking more like, what is the platform that makes the most sense? So I could go on forever because I think that this book is really amazing. I think it's a really good roadmap for any new podcaster looking to starting a podcast and or looking to launch the podcast, because I know that I will 100% be using this for the launch of the podcast, the Envisionaire podcast, which is supposed to be launched in the next month or so, which is very, very exciting. We actually have a podcast launch party set, which is very, very exciting. and I will be doing a video on that, kind of the build up to the launch party, and obviously also sharing with you the launch party. I think it's going to be really, really exciting. So for anyone watching this video after the Envision Your Podcast has been launched, then please do check out that video of the launch party, which is on here. And of course, check out the Envision Your Podcast. All links will be below, and watch for season 2, which is going to be all video podcasts. So very, very exciting. Anyway, thanks so much for coming with me on this book review of Chris Huskins' book. And I really look forward to sharing with you guys my podcast journey.